The Salishan people of the Pacific Northwest have a story about the very first tribe there ever was and why that tribe disbanded. And the story starts with an argument. And it was an argument in the tribe between a man and a woman. And it was an argument that raged for days and days. And every person in the tribe ended up getting sucked into it. And the argument was about the sound that ducks make as they're flying. So there's a high-pitched humming sound that they make. And the man was adamant that the sound was caused by the movement of air through the duck's beak. And the woman said, no, that's absolutely absurd. The sound is caused by the movement of air through the duck's wings. And the chief tried to solve the argument but couldn't. And eventually it got so bad that people just started leaving the tribe. And they dispersed throughout the land. And they went so far away that they started developing their own languages until they could no longer even understand each other. Then across the world, the Wasania people, Bantu people in East Africa, they have a story of a great flood that then caused a famine, and it caused everyone in the tribe to go mad. And in that madness, they started babbling incoherently, and they could no longer understand each other. We have a myth in this part of the world as well, the Tower of Babel, which you'll probably be familiar with. But this myth is actually repeated all over the world in cultures that never had any contact with each other. So it's really a myth that's older than all of us here, and one our ancestors are really familiar with. And for me, it's not really a myth about the origin of language, but it's a myth about understanding. And the Tower of Babel is a nice example because as the tower is being built by this tribe that all speak one language and have this incredible project to build a tower that'll reach the heavens, God comes down and in Old Testament God fashion says, no, this is unacceptable, because the reason that's given in the Bible is what could they achieve? Look what they could achieve when they all understand each other. They can pretty much achieve anything they imagine. And so he destroys the tower and everyone's scattered and everyone develops their own tongue and can't understand one another. So, welcome to the Rebel Wisdom Summit. Today is really an experiment in whether we can find new ways to all understand one another. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do today and why we're doing it in this format and what the day ahead looks like. So, we're going to, as you probably know already, be splitting off into groups to have our own conversations, our own kind of experiment of a new way of understanding one another. Shortly, the speakers, our four brilliant speakers, are going to come up on stage. And then we're going to break off into our first group. We're going to do that twice, once this morning, and then once again in the afternoon. And they're going to be a little bit different. We'll talk about it a little bit later. So, also, in your bags, you have a map of all the, you don't have to find it now, but of all the wonderful places you can eat in this area. So this area is renowned as a culinary destination. So we've made a map that shows you what you can grab to eat at lunch. We'll also have time later on for you to ask questions to the speakers. And in the afternoon sessions in the small groups, the speakers will be walking around as well. So there will be time for that. I'm going to hand over to, my name is Alexander Beiner, by the way. This is David. And before we get into more of the framing of the day, we wanted to just kind of check in with how we're feeling right now. How is it to be up here, David?
So in a second, we're going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and do this as well. We thought we'd model it just to
be embarrassed.
Ground ourselves a little bit. So I'm feeling that sort of midway point between nervousness and excitement, and I'm choosing to decide it's excitement. Ali, how are you feeling?
I feel hot. My face feels hot. I feel excited, and yeah, I feel happy to be here. I feel grateful that everyone's here as well, so yeah. Yeah, so as David just mentioned, we'd like you to do that and give a little bit of time to just find a person sitting next to you, preferably someone you don't know already. So it might have to be someone behind you in that case.
How are you feeling about being here?
Yeah, and the question is just how are you feeling about being here right now? How is it for you to be here right now at the summit?
Just going to talk a little bit about the history of Rebel Wisdom and kind of leading up to this event. And I know, because we asked you all to fill out questionnaires before you came, that 87% of you have watched one of our films. So you will know a little bit about the journey and the media channel. But I'd like to just tell the story a little bit and what the framing of the channel is and leading up to kind of this event here. So Rebel Wisdom it's an evolving conversation. And the main topics of it are the challenge of sense-making, the sense that our sense-making institutions are breaking down at an ever-increasing rate, something that Jordan Greenhall talks a lot about, this kind of shift from broadcast to digital, and that's a very significant shift. And also the meaning crisis. We had an interview with John Vervaeke quite recently. He's released a series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And that's something that so the first film that we put out was with Jordan Peterson about a year and a half ago, before he kind of shot to fame. And clearly he's quite a controversial figure. I think he'd also accept that. He's quite a controversial figure. But what I found most astonishing about him was the phenomenon of his success and this sense of the deep mythopoetic Bible language becoming part of the mainstream conversation. After I worked in the media for many years as a journalist, and this sense of that the conversation was being held hostage by the new atheists, by sort of the Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, everyone being scared of kind of talking about these deeper themes for fear of being being made fun of, or that there was a real sense of that the conversation was stuck, and this sense of the conversation becoming freed up again, that we could talk about these much deeper themes in public. And I think that for me is what that signified. And then we've had these kind of big, high-profile debates between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris about the nature of truth and selling out huge arenas, and that's a really amazing thing to see, this kind of intellectual awakening that we very much feel is tied to long-form content, to the liberation of digital media, kind of filling in the gaps that the mainstream media was not filling. And this sense that there are a lot of neglected perspectives and ideas, and also that a lot of the way that we've run society is breaking down, and we need to find new ideas from somewhere. This is something that I think is being increasingly obvious to all of us, that something about society is off and being increasingly recognized that it's off, and the only way out is to bring in some new ideas, some of the ideas that have been sort of on the fringes of the culture and have never been part of the culture. We're very lucky that some of the speakers the speakers we have here are bringing some of those perspectives. I'm thinking particularly of Iain's work of actually the way we perceive the world. There is a bias in the way that we perceive the world, even in the structure of our brains, of what we're able to see and what we're not able to see. And we've expanded that conversation. We started with Jordan Peterson. It grew very organically from there, and we've brought in other voices to that. For example, Stan Groff, Ken Wilber, Iain McGilchrist, Jordan Greenhall, Bret Weinstein, Heather Hying. And there's also a sense that we have that this conversation has a direction. There's a teleology to it. There's a sense that it's moving somewhere. And I talked about that with John Vervaeke, the professor of psychology at Toronto, who works with Jordan Peterson and teaches Buddhist meditation and Tai Chi alongside the philosophy and psychology that he teaches. And that's very much, not wanting to jump ahead too much, but that sort of embodied wisdom is a real part of what we think needs, the synthesis that we think needs to happen as well. And I asked him what he felt, where he felt this conversation was going. And I think it's a conscious integration of the wisdom traditions. That if we had a cultural block around that for a long time with the new atheists, the freeing of that perspective, and I've seen it happen online, just this, the center of gravity shift from sort of the Sam Harris acolytes who are basically sort of saying, oh, how can you believe that? You're an idiot. To other people saying, well, how can you dismiss all of this? You're the idiot. And there's a real sense of, okay, where is this conversation going? Is there a possibility for synthesis? And this possibility of synthesis, I think we'll talk about, feels very urgent as well. I don't think we've got time to mess around. And so, yeah, I think, and when we announced this event, this is sold out very, very quickly. So I think everyone in this room who is attracted to come to this also senses this in some way. The sense of the direction of the conversation. We see this a lot with the people who are supporting us as subscribers and are following us on YouTube, is this sort of sense of recognition. Even though we're not entirely sure where we're going with this conversation, we're trying to stay alert and alive to where it wants to go. But there is a sense of, oh, I get what this is, even though we haven't even defined it ourselves in some sense. I don't think you can define it. But there is this very strong sense with, and as I said, it's an emerging conversation that we've been following and been inspired by all the people that we've been interviewing and have changed a lot of the stuff that we're doing as we've had these conversations with people. And this sense that most of the people that we're drawn towards and we really resonate with that we're interviewing also have the sense that we're poised in a way for catastrophe or transformation. And I think that is becoming more and more clear, and I think a lot of people are intuiting that. And there's very different ways that's showing up, and there's different narratives about how that's showing up. But I think we all sense that something's shifting. An old way is coming to an end, and something new could be born. And this sort of sense of ever-decreasing circles as well in politics and culture, that we're even sort of Hollywood films sort of seem like they're running out of ideas. Like everything seems to be running out of ideas at the same time. There's a kind of race to the bottom in so many different areas of culture and politics. And we'll talk a bit more. We'll unpack a few of these themes with the speakers in a few minutes when we invite the speakers up onto the stage. And part of this is we've talked about the shadow of liberalism, that there was a sort of low-resolution narrative around liberalism that is breaking down, and a tribalism that pretends it's not a tribalism. And I think a lot of people were woken up with Brexit and with Trump over here in the UK that, okay, we can't pretend that that the system is not giving us some pretty bad choices and incredibly polarizing choices. And we've talked about this shadow of liberalism, this tribalism that pretends it's not a tribalism, but actually, for me, both Brexit and Trump were exactly that, this sort of sense of we're incredibly tolerant to absolutely everyone apart from those deplorables. I think in both cases we have a society that's split, getting too far ahead of itself, and that's evidence of that polarization. Some kind of healing process needs to happen before we can move forward in both the UK and the US. And it's also a very complex conversation, because I think some of the reaction to the liberal consensus is reactionary. There is a rise in authoritarianism. That is going on at the same time that there is a possibility of how can we pull this conversation up to a new level. So this is it's a very delicate thing, because from one perspective you could argue, well, it's all reactionary, it's all authoritarian, it's just the world's getting worse. But I think there's a potential for us to pull the conversation up to a new level. And I don't think, if we don't do that, I don't think we're going to get out of the bind that we find ourselves in. And also, a really important driver of this backlash is a feeling of some things that cannot be said, a sort of stifling of conversation. And we were talking yesterday about, as a journalist, I'm very familiar and driven by this idea of speaking truth to power. I think a lot of journalists kind of get into this because I feel kind of inspired to speak truth to power. And in the social media age, a lot of this power is kind of distributed. It's social shaming, it's the power of the mob, it's the power of not being able to say certain things. And not being able to say things wrong. Not being able to how do we think in public if every time we sort of don't express ourselves perfectly or we don't give enough context that we're attacked and we kind of learn not to say certain things. So there is something that needs to happen with this kind of increased polarization, especially driven by social media, that we need to create spaces to have these conversations that we feel that we're not able to express. And to make mistakes and to say things wrong and to be challenged and to not feel that is going to be potentially career-ending sometimes. We've seen some people on social media and Twitter and things taken out of context. So it's not just the what. There is a what, the ideas that we need to talk about, for sure. There's a definite what to be described, but the how is as important. The how is equally important as the what. And the how is why we're here, is this event. So I'm going to hand back to Ali, who's going to talk a little bit about how we're going to run the how.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the how, but also the why. Like, why have we created the event in this format instead of just an event where we come and we watch people speak and maybe have a Q&A or something like that. Before I do that, I'm curious to see, raise your hand if you've had an argument on social media in the last 2 years. Okay, keep your hand up. Keep your hand raised if that argument ended in either you or the other person really changing their minds and coming back with a completely new perspective. Yeah. There's 2 brave souls or 3, yeah. So I think
those guys should be doing the event, actually.
Yeah, probably, yeah. So that is an experience I think a lot of us have had, and it's ironic for us being a YouTube channel because we've really realized as we've been doing this just how impossible it is to have the kind of conversation we need to have on social media. It must be done face-to-face, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And I want to talk a little bit about the science of that. So we know, I won't go into all of the kind of nitty-gritty neuroscience, but we know a lot happens when we're connecting. When I look at somebody and I see their eyes, I see the dilation of their pupils, I see their body language, I can smell pheromones, I can really be in the moment with someone. It's very different from sitting behind a keyboard. David also mentioned something I think is really key, which is this idea of having conversations that aren't necessarily easy in the moment, that we don't really know quite if we got the point fully articulated, but we're kind of feeling into it, and we know that there might be some potential social cost for expressing an idea that might not be popular with, let's say, our tribe. And that is, to really understand that and understand the physiology of that, I think is very important as well. And that's what we've been trying to do over the last year or so. We've been running events like this on a smaller scale with speakers and then breaking off into groups as we're going to be doing today. And the reason is because we don't think that the intellectual level is enough, let's say. It's not enough to come at these problems intellectually. It just doesn't work. We need to come at it with an understanding of that physiology. And so there's a few useful models. One is polyvagal theory, which talks about the vagus nerve and its role in our nervous system's role in effectively putting us into either a defensive mode, where we feel under threat and we shut down, we start thinking differently, we're less open to new ideas, and we're really defending ourselves. And that we can see that when we fall into an ideological position or a really fixed position. It's like, no, I'm not budging. It's not safe to budge. So we need to understand how we can, let's say, hack our bodies and come into a more relaxed exploratory mode. And it's a skill, it's a subtle thing we can often feel. And we have to be quite mindful, we have to be quite aware of ourselves. And that idea of being aware of ourselves is something that's also really important today. this sense of, we're going to use a few different words, sovereignty is one of them, but the sense of being responsible for my own responses. In fact, everyone signed a kind of agreement on coming here around taking responsibility for our own inner world as best we can. And that means a few things. It means really being aware of, okay, I really feel something is coming up when we talk about this topic. I feel myself getting a bit defensive, or I feel myself shutting down. I feel myself wanting to blame or label. And just noticing that that's happening. And then also noticing, are we really listening to one another? Are we in a relaxed space where we're truly in contact with one another? Because that's another really key aspect of being sovereign, being here, being centered in ourselves. And it is from that place where we kind of understand ourselves and we take responsibility for ourselves that we can all connect with each other, and that the way we connect with each other leads to something greater than the sum of its parts. And that's a really big theme today as well. The whole artwork that we've chosen for the event, you might have seen on your way in, is a nod to that. Is we're all, in a sense, autonomous units, but we're all connected as well. And so when we come into, let's say, coherence with one another, like entrainment and clocks, we kind of reach a rhythm with one another. We don't lose our individuality, and we don't lose our sense of who we are, but we start interacting with each other in a different way. And that's kind of what we're experimenting with today. Can we get into that place with one another? And the irony, the paradox is, in order to do that, we have to get into that place alone. So that's kind of that's the why. That's why we're breaking off into groups. That's why we've assembled an incredible group of facilitators who I'm going to be introducing a little bit later. And that's why we're also going to be using some techniques today to help us get into that mode, help us relax, help us activate our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the kind of rest and digest. It's the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system, where we're feeling in fight or flight or freeze. And we know that from that space, from the fight or flight, we can't have a productive, generative conversation. It just doesn't work. We have to get into a space of relaxation and curiosity. There's also another really key term. We're not entirely sure in that space what the answer is. We have an idea maybe, but we're open to hearing, maybe there's some aspect of it. And there's a phrase we use a lot, yes and. It's a phrase that it comes from, it's actually an improv, but it's also an integral studies, and a lot of other areas use it. But it's a sense of there's partial truths everywhere. So we say, instead of saying no but, or yes but, it's yes and, yes, there's a piece there, and I'm feeling this piece as well. And through that, we start building something. If in an improv, someone's like, I'm holding a jug, and someone's like, no, you're not. That's a rake. It just kills the whole thing. So what we're going to try and do is get into a space together where we kind of experiment with it and we hold it lightly and see if we can get into a bit of a flow together. And we're going to do that now with some breathing. I just want to talk about, before we do it, I just want to talk about the breath as a really useful tool for us to stay present with and connected with. The breath can change our physiology when we take control of it. It's mostly, we're not aware of it a lot of the time. We go throughout our day, and as soon as we become aware of it, we can see how closely linked the breath is to our inner state and our physiology. And so by controlling the breath, we can actually get into a space in ourselves where we're in that parasympathetic response. It only takes about 3 minutes of breathing. And also where we do something all together. And we kind of get into a flow together. So we're going to do that. And it's going to be up here. So hopefully everyone should be able to see that. This animation can start now. And it's very self-explanatory. We're just going to breathe together.
We promised that was the most culty thing we're going to get you to do for the rest of the day. Interestingly, the logo, so when we were thinking about the logo, we were like, okay, we want eye and triangle because we want awareness and truth. And all of the combinations look kind of way too culty. And we're like, the one thing we really don't want is to look culty. And then almost the first comment that we had on YouTube was, your logo is Illuminati as fuck, but you seem legit. Which is still my favorite YouTube comment, so what can you do? So before I interview the speakers one by one, and we have a discussion before we break out into the groups, just want to talk a little bit about confidentiality, because confidentiality is a big part of what we're doing here. And you may have noticed, the sharp-eyed among you will have noticed that we do have cameras here. So with the cameras, we're going to be filming up to the morning. There will be a certain point in the afternoon where the cameras will be turned off. And also, when you go into your small groups, we won't be filming. We will get some stills so we can sort of tell the story of the day, but we won't be filming any audio. We won't be filming anything of what you're talking about in the groups, because that will remain confidential. This is something that we do in our retreats. So we run retreats for men and retreats for women, and confidentiality is a huge thing there, because we're asking people to bring sort of very intimate parts of their lives. So we ask for confidentiality at the beginning. Could I ask if you agree to confidentiality in your small groups, that you could raise your hand now? Great. Let's just look around.
Yeah, just take a moment to look around and just...
Yeah. Great. Brilliant.
We'd also just like to ask people... We'd also like to ask people to turn their phones off, please, for the duration of the day while we're in...
Or at least put them on plane mode.
Yeah, off is better, but if you want plane mode as well. Yeah, it just helps us also to just be present with one another, and that we just all have an understanding when no one's live tweeting, no one's recording anything like that.
Yeah, often at events like this, we'll give a hashtag and say, can you tweet this? We'd like you not to tweet, because this is part of what we'll talk about, kind of what shuts down conversations, things being taken out of context. And for everyone to feel that they are able to express themselves, we want that to be... We want to know that things are being shared in context. So we're going to ask you not to tweet stuff from the event. We are going to now introduce the speakers one by one, have a little dialogue with them, and then we're going to open up into a bigger dialogue with all four on stage. And you'll let me know when we need to wrap up. Great. We haven't run this through completely, so if there's any frayed around the edges, that's on us. So first, I'd like to introduce Bret Weinstein. So Bret has... We featured Bret on the channel quite a bit, maybe 4 or 5 films we've put out with you. Something like that. So, is that on?
Hello.
Hello?
No.
So...
I'll speak loud. Oh, that's
Yeah.
better. Okay.
So Bret, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Bret Weinstein. I was, until 2 years ago, a professor at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. I teach evolutionary biology, which I take as license to transgress virtually every disciplinary boundary that there is, and that's worked out pretty well for me. So I don't know, what else is there to say, really?
I'd like to ask a couple of questions, just picking up from the introduction. Why evolutionarily do we feel that when people disagree with this, why do we feel that as a threat to ourselves? Because the neuroscience is quite clear that when people disagree with our identity, we take that as a threat in the same way that we would a physical threat.
I think if I can step back from the question a little bit just to make the answer clearer, we humans are products of evolution through and through, which is something that actually our education doesn't properly prepare us to understand. We have the sense, we all know that we evolved, but we have the sense that we have somehow exited that story and entered some different story, which really couldn't be farther from the truth. We are fully products of evolution living in an environment that we did not evolve in. So the environment is almost fully novel, and we bring our ancient toolkit to it. And the map of how well that toolkit does with respect to the things we encounter is almost totally arbitrary. There are some ways in which our ancient tools are pretty good for the modern environment. There are some ways in which they're perfectly appalling. And which things are in what category is something nobody tells us to think about, which is a shame. We would do better. And so in answer to your question, the problem is we don't understand what it would have meant for an ancestor in the relatively recent past to have found themselves on the wrong end of an argument in which their group, which would likely have been a kin group, outgrouped them. So what I would argue is that being disagreed with is the near end of a continuum that ends. The other end of the continuum is the witch hunt, where you have an outgroup of one, right? And that person very frequently ends up dead, right? And there are a lot of terrible things that can befall you on the way to the far end of the continuum. So what I'm getting at is that when we are disagreed with in some sort of profound way in public, we begin to detect that, oh goodness, I'm being pushed towards that end of the continuum, and the only thing over there is catastrophe. So it is not a false sense. And in some ways, the Twitter mob that we've all seen is the reinvention of something quite ancient that we all understand in some intuitive way, not an explicit way, but an intuitive way. And we would be wise to recognize that in our current circumstance, nothing good will come of it.
And I talked about as well the sense that a lot of the people we're speaking to think we're in a certainly the existential threats are mounting. And you said something really interesting in your dialogue with your brother Eric about all we have is our evolutionary toolkit. And you used the phrase, you can't dance with the one that brung you, which I thought was a really kind of lyrical way of describing the problem. Could you explain what that means?
Sure. So if you think about what a human being is, we are maybe the most amazing product of natural selection that exists. And the reason that we're amazing is because we have a basic platform that can do a lot of different things, and then we have a mind that is capable of being rewritten. The software component of us can be rewritten for a new niche. So if you think about all the other species they typically inhabit a fairly narrow niche. They do something through which they produce food or discover it, and they hide from their predators, they dodge their parasites. We live in thousands of different niches, and we have over evolutionary history. That is a remarkable and very exceptional thing for an individual species to be able to do. But the problem is that the thing that created that capacity, the best argument we've got is that human versus human competition is what augmented our capacity to diversify, to see opportunities, and the like. So our best tools arise out of what I would call lineage against lineage competition. We are now armed with weapons that are so ferociously powerful. We are now interconnected in a completely unprecedented way, and we are living at a density on this planet that those very instincts towards lineage against lineage competition are going to doom us in the very near term if we don't stop doing it. And the problem is that all of our instincts tell us that our survival depends on us successfully competing in this way, and our actual survival depends on us stopping. So can we wake up enough to recognize that the very things that we have gotten so good at, that have been the key to all of the populations that we came from arriving at the present, those are the very things we must avoid. That's a very difficult thing to become aware of and to pull off, but we're depending on it.
That's a good point to pause. Bret, if you could take your place on the sofa, and if we could invite Heather Hying to the stage. Need to fix my kitchen timer. Very high res, everything up here. So, Heather, great. Heather, I think we've put out maybe 3 films with you, and I want to talk a little bit about why one of them did so much better than the others and what that says about where we're at in terms of the balance between, partly to do with mainstream media and alternative media. But I'd love if you could just introduce yourself first.
Sure. I'm Heather Iain, not coincidentally also an evolutionary biologist who, until 2017, worked as a professor at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, with my husband. We have known each other since we were teenagers, and so in many ways have developed a worldview together, but are also very, very different human beings. And so the toolkit to which Bret refers is one which is somewhat understood by other evolutionary biologists and somewhat co-developed. But also, when I had students, which I loved having, college students, I explicitly inhabited the role of teacher of and promoter of being an animal behaviorist and a statistician and a philosopher of science. So I just want to say a couple of words about each of those things. Animal behavior, and of course we are animals. Animal behavior is the study of what it is that we're doing while trying not to misunderstand people's claims about what they're doing, organisms' claims about what they're doing, with what it actually means. And when you're looking at organisms that don't lie with language, or tell the truth with language, it's easier to actually determine what's true. And so if you use those same tools as you use when you're looking at, as I did, poison frogs in Madagascar, for instance, on a group of humans, one thing that Bret and I have said often is turn down the volume on an interaction and you're more likely to end up with insight about what's actually going on. So teaching students not just the tools of animal behavior, but how to engage as the animals which we are, in good faith and with compassion. Statistics, of course, is a modern way by which we reduce the human fallibility in our understanding of the universe. It itself is fallible, but used with care, it is an extraordinary tool. And then specifically with regard to philosophy of science, how is it that we make claims of truth? What are the claims of truth that we make, and how is it that we make those claims of truth? This which is epistemology, is how we should be going forth into the world, engaging in any question. When you hear a claim, if it sounds absurd to you or absolutely right or anywhere in between, still you should be wondering, on what basis does that person think it's true? On what basis do I think it's true or not true? And to the degree that there's a gap between those things, why?
I'd like to interject. Do you think that we're losing that ability in popular discourse to make those distinctions?
Quite, exactly, which is, I think part of why I brought it up. That scientists are supposed to be skeptical above all, right? To not hold as self-evident almost anything. We do have basic assumptions. There are some things which we consider axiomatic, but we try to minimize those assumptions as much as possible. And as we engage with others, it's quite clear that almost no one is acting in the world, actually, as a skeptic, as a scientist. We tend to approach most topics either with full faith or full cynicism, and neither of those is a position from which it's easy to move.
And you've found yourself, after your Evergreen experience, as being identified with free speech. And is that something that's new for you?
Yeah, I think it is. I hadn't explicitly considered it in those terms before, but in every single class I ever had, I would tell my undergraduates, failure is expected. It's not the best outcome, but it's expected because if you fail, it is demonstrable that you have tried. And if you try with risk, be it intellectual risk, physical risk, psychological risk, intellectual risk being the kind of risk we most likely see in classrooms, although because of the nature of the work, there was also physical risk, and because of the nature of the community building, also psychological risk. When you take risk, there will be failure. Therefore, failure is acceptable. Failing to fail is not acceptable. Failing to fail is evidence that you didn't try. So when we see evidence of people self-censoring or the mob trying to invoke self-censoring, either of those things are an attempt to cause the conversation to stop, which will be a failing to fail, just a stopping of discourse.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk about because we've talked before about how it's very difficult to have some of these conversations. You and Bret were both teaching some of the most difficult or fraught topics in the media now, sort of the difference, genetic difference between men and women, evolved sex differences, the sort of thing that seems to explode whenever it's just talked about in public or on Twitter. And you did that for 10 years in one of the most progressive colleges in the country, which I think is something that many people don't appreciate or understand about your background. What I wanted to kind of say here is, it's very easy to say, well, these things are not talked about, we need to talk about them. That's not strictly true, because they are talked about, and the conversation can often go quite septic and quite toxic. Like, there is a balance of what things are talked about, because free speech, for example, is now being seen as a right-wing value in the US, for example. And there is a kind of polarization. I think we need to sort of be a little bit more high resolution when we're saying, well, these sort of topics can't be talked about. Like, where can't they be talked about, and where can they? Because what seems to happen is that where they can be talked about, they get talked about in a way that then increases the polarization, like between the mainstream and the alternative media, for example.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
Well, for 15 years, indeed, I and Bret both were talking exactly about evolution of sex differences, what gender is in humans, and we call it sex roles in non-human animals, evolution of all sorts of very nasty things, which are nonetheless evolutionary, things like genocide, things like rape. And we did so in communities that were forgiving and interested in seeking answers. We made clear every single program, and usually did not have to remind students too often of the naturalistic fallacy, which is that we do not conflate what is with what ought. And so by recognizing what is, we are not making moral claims. And indeed, in order to make moral claims and in order to have action by which we can change society, we first have to know what is. So don't we in fact need to know what is true first, rather than shut our ears and pretend that it isn't true? So I found that in my classrooms, we could talk about just about anything. And we also made it clear that you were not to conflate disagreement with an idea with dislike of a person. Right? Those are two very different things, and we should be able to hold in our hearts simultaneously, I respect this person, I may even love this person depending on who it is, but this particular thing I don't agree with, let's see what we can do. Where is there, maybe sometimes there's just a fundamental disagreement, sometimes there's miscommunication, sometimes there is wrong information on one side or both. Those are all ways that disagreement can happen, but never does it need to be equated with dislike of the human being. So I could talk about just about anything with my students. I can't say the same thing for my colleagues. I almost never could. So the faculty at least American colleges and universities, and I suspect across at least the Western world, have become a much more ideological and polemic bunch than, at this point, a generation of students who have been largely broken, thanks to the adults, by a combination of helicopter parenting and big pharma with mood disruptors and screens that addict them, a whole suite of things that actually make it harder for them to be adults in the world. And yet, they were receptive. They were receptive basically to a person. in a way that the people who already had the authority granted them by their degrees tended not to be.
Right. So much here to pick up on once we start the dialogue. But Heather, thank you very much. You could join Bret. And I'm going to invite Jordan Greenhall onto the stage. Yeah, good. So, Jordan, we actually spoke first for pretty much one of the first films that we put out, the Glitch in the Matrix film, about the Jordan Peterson and Kathy Newman interview. Mm-hmm. And since then, I think
I was in my backyard in my robe while you were talking. Little did I know that he was a guy who could actually create films and put them on the internet.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the concepts that you've come up with and have talked about, like sovereignty, for example, the idea of the blue church and the red religion, that you've popularized or have had a real impact on the way that we see the world and and on a lot of the films that we've put out there. I'd like to give you a little space just to introduce yourself first and how you come to be here.
My name's Jordan. It's Hall, by the way. I was Greenhall, and then I changed it back to my maiden name, Hall. Everywhere else in the world, except for in Dave's head, that has been fully accepted.
I don't want to have to retitle all of the films. It's just...
There's a path dependency problem. In complexity science, it's called a frozen accident. So, I'm a father of 3. I have a 6-month-old at home. Be mindful of the fact that in the States, this is Mother's Day. I'm a husband of 1, and one might imagine not a particularly good one, since I've left her at home with a 6-month-old while I'm here with you. I suppose that's all that needs to be said.
Great. And so I'd love to... we were talking through some of these ideas yesterday, and so we talked about sovereignty, and I imagine there's quite a few people here who might have seen some of our films where we've discussed the concepts and might be familiar with it. But I think you said something about that maturity was valuable before, but it's essential now. And that's quite a good place to start from.
Yeah, let's. It seems like something that Bret said earlier might be a good way to bring that into clarity. So if we imagine 100 years ago, let's start 1,000 years ago, a certain capacity to make good choices, a certain ability to, let's just say, be wise, was acceptable in the context of at least the larger story. So I might fuck up rather badly and might harm myself and maybe a handful of other people who I care about, but this really wasn't going to put a dent in humanity or in nature. And even if you fast forward to 1945, we, at least the West, fucked up rather badly, and were able to kill millions of people, tens of millions of people, and harm nature quite substantially. But even then, it wasn't that significant in the bigger story. More or less immediately thereafter, though, we began to find ourselves in a very different circumstance. Apparently, I'm not supposed to be able to see. This is focusing on other senses. Where, with the beginning of nuclear weapons, and then their both intensification and proliferation, we found ourselves for the very first time in the novel situation that a lack of adequate maturity, a lack of adequate wisdom, could in fact put an end to the human story completely. And this capacity of innovation, this capacity to change the environment that we find ourselves in to suit ourselves, has not slowed down since then. In fact, it's sped up. And so every day in every way, we just get better and better at killing everybody. And so what happens is we find ourselves in a circumstance where a level of maturity and wisdom that was adequate to, say, 1977 isn't adequate to now. And a level of maturity and wisdom that's adequate to now won't be adequate to 2025. And I believe that if you run run the movie forward, you find that as we increasingly become capable, more and more people increasingly become capable of doing more and more harm, the only solution is that everyone has to become substantially more capable of taking responsibility for the power that we have. So that's maybe that.
Yeah, which is a fantastic segue into the concept of sovereignty.
Maybe. Yeah, I've been thinking about this since last night. So let me see, there's a few ways of trying to convey the sense. Can I do Rule Omega first?
Sure, yeah.
There was a video that was put up a couple of days ago, weeks ago, something like that, where we actually talked about it, Daniel, Jamie, and I. So the proposition is something like this. There's a circumstance where we find ourselves wanting and needing to actually communicate. And I want to make a distinction between hearing and listening. And we want to be able to listen, not just to hear. And this is where the things that we're dealing with are in fact meaningful, the most meaningful things. By the way, very practically, like when you're having a conversation with your wife, most meaningful. It's good to be able to listen to your wife, not merely hear her. And I would say that the moment that we find ourselves in now is a moment where more and more that's the case in almost every conversation. The Tower of Babel problem being to the point. So we might say that Rule Omega is the antidote to the Tower of Babel problem. That when we speak different languages, we cannot hear each other, but when we listen deeply enough, we can listen no matter what. So the idea is that there's a way for me to show up where, as a listener, I choose to enter into a disposition of inquiry, of curiosity, of not knowing and knowing that I don't know what is being expressed, and endeavoring the best that I can to listen deeply enough to hear and honor that which is trying to speak itself. And I would say also a disposition of humility that allows me to have the space inside myself to let that land. And then, as a person who's expressing, the innocence, the vulnerability, and the courage to, in myself, find that which wants to be expressed and allow it to come out with as much integrity as I can muster. Now, I think it is reasonable to notice that there's a certain risk to playing either of these roles. And it certainly isn't guaranteed that you'll find yourself in a dialogue that fits the criteria of Rule Omega in a healthy fashion. But we can certainly try. And I've also found that it is possible to play either role with anyone. And in the moment we find ourselves in, it may be increasingly important to be able to do so. So now sovereignty. So in the context of sovereignty, first I invite you to enter into Rule Omega with me. I'm about to say something that may sound very foolish, or certainly won't be expressed particularly eloquently. But also that if you find yourself actually able to enter into your own sovereignty, you perhaps might be able to listen to what it's trying to say itself. So I think we can actually begin with some very simple examples and work our way up.
We do need to do this relatively quickly to get Iain up.
Oh, I'm sorry, time is passing now.
Yes.
I apologize. Well, then I'll say this and no more. Is that enough?
Sorry?
I'll say this and then
Yeah.
what's anything else? So the proposition is that you can take a look at a certain context and notice whether or not you have sovereignty in that context. So if we see a dancer who's very skillful at dance, and we notice that as the music is moving, we can see that her body is moving fluidly in relationship with that music. And there's an elegance of hand and foot that is clean and clear and smooth and almost effortless, that she is sovereign in the context of dance. And we can say that we watch a child moving from toddler to a child who can actually run. They become sovereign in the context of walking. When we speak of sovereignty here, we're trying to speak of something where we are sovereign in the context of the whole of life. Of how do you become capable of being able to achieve a level of mastery in all the aspects of living that you can show with that same level of effortlessness and clarity and sensitivity to what is actually happening now that is equal to the dancer in the music. And this combines things that we're familiar with. It combines maturity, the ability to respond to what's happening and not bring more or less than what's happening, and to be aware of what's happening inside of you so that you're simply responsible for it, not to get shocked or angry when people disrupt your conversation.
Just testing.
And then I would add, by the way, 2 more things: wisdom and skillfulness. Wisdom might be the ability to be able to actually respond with what is a good choice in the current context. And then skillfulness, the ability to actually deliver on what is called for in a way that creates as few ripples in the pond as you can manage. So I would say that's perhaps a way of considering the notion of sovereignty.
Thank you. Would you like to take your place on the table? So, I'd like to welcome our final guest to the stage, Iain McGilchrist.
Oh, I'm switched on.
Switched on.
That's a new experience.
So, Iain, I was familiar with your work before we did the interview. I think towards the end of last year, and but I was very taken with what you said in the interview. There was much more depth to what you were saying and the things you were referring than I'd taken from your work before. So I'm very glad that you agreed to break your writing silence to come down here for this event. Would you like to introduce yourself and just a brief overview of your work?
Yes, I'm Iain McGilchrist. I very briefly started out in the humanities with interests in philosophy and literature, and then trained as a doctor and have practiced as a psychiatrist for a long time. And then my inspiration for that was an interest in the so-called mind-body problem. And I wrote a book, which some of you may know about, called The Master and His Emissary, which, much to my amazement, has been widely read, and which is probably why I'm here.
Great. And your work, we talked about the meta-crisis, and your work very much looks at that and roots it in our very perception of the world.
Yes.
Could you explain that?
Well, yes. In brief, I put forward the idea that there are 2 ways, well, of course there are an infinite number of ways of looking at the world, but that our brain delivers for different purposes 2 sort of versions of the world, one of which is very rich and complex and broad and sustained, in which things are not ever isolated and are constantly changing, which is true to experience. But it doesn't help us manipulate the world. In order to manipulate the world, to use it, we need to have a different kind of attention, which is a narrow-focused, highly detailed attention. And this creates a vision of the world as atomistic that has to be put together in order to understand it. And it's a bit like the map, by comparison with the territory that is mapped. And roughly speaking, I say the left hemisphere produces a virtual image of the world, and the right hemisphere gives us the rich, lived, embodied, complex world. And that we trade these off together at a level below consciousness all the time. I think that one of the things that's happened is that a lot of the things that give meaning to life, or have given meaning to life, for people in the past have been not explicit and in the focus of attention in that left hemisphere way, but are intuitive, embodied, a kind of wisdom that comes from living with people, living in the natural world, and thinking about your experience. A lot of that has been disrupted. We no longer have such, as it were, intuitive understanding of who it is we live with and where we live. Most of us are no longer living somewhere where we're in natural contact with nature. And society is, it's a cliche to say this, but it is much harder to make sense of because it's fragmented in various ways. I think that what happens under these circumstances is that people feel they've lost identity and they've lost a meaning and purpose, and they grab something which is offered by the left hemisphere, which is a very poor substitute, which is I identify as and with and so on. And this is a purely theoretical stance, and it has all the disadvantages of it, that you create categories, and you put people into categories. You no longer deal with embodied individuals with all their complexity, with all their subtlety. And it's rather paradoxical that the people who are most keen on the idea that we are complex and embodied nonetheless gravitate to these very simplistic ways of thinking. And I would just put in a plea for complexity, for the idea that you may think in the abstract that X is good and Y is bad, but as you live, you come to see that nothing is wholly good and nothing is wholly bad. And certainly it's not true that if you happen to think something is good, more and more and more of it will make it better. There is always a just amount of everything, and it's only deciding where that just amount is. Now, if that conversation had been happening in the political realm, instead of being shut down by, I would call the authoritarian left, who very much govern the media, we wouldn't have had the catastrophes of Trump and Brexit. The thing could have been moderated as we went, and that is how you want a situation to evolve, by an interrelationship, a dialogue, a taking into account of different points of view. Instead, a whole lot of people have been labeled as stupid, ignorant, bigoted, fascist, outright, whatever ridiculous term you use just to dismiss it. And so legitimate concerns were never listened to. And they've now erupted, as they do. The dark side, if you don't accept it and don't attend to it, will come up and bite you, and that is what we're living through now.
This feels like a good time to kind of open it out to Bret and Heather. Have you experienced any of this? But yeah, I'd love for you guys to spark off each other and make me as redundant as possible as a moderator. But if you want to pick up
Sure.
on that.
You want us to pick up on that exact point, or just things that have been mentioned so far?
Well, whatever you feel that you want to pick up on that's been mentioned by any of the panelists so far.
So I would want to actually maybe tie these things together. So Jordan said something about the necessity of maturity having gone up. I want to add another dimension to that, which is that maturity happens as a result of a developmental process. And because, well, for a lot of reasons, partly because we live in circumstances that don't look in any way like our ancestral circumstances, the conditions that create maturity have become much rarer. So we need it more, and the things that generate it are rarer, and therefore, and I think Jordan's distinction is a good one. You may be adult in some context, but the number of people who are adult enough to see the world more or less as it is and, I don't know, be properly frightened by that and motivated to do something about it is very small. And if there's something I would be eager to see, it would be us consciously amplify those processes by which people mature into that stratum. And what you're pointing to, Iain, is the failure of that. It is the reduction in resolution of conversation down to a level where nothing useful could emerge from it.
I think I would add to that that modern scientists being viewed as the authority figures to which many of us look, is so reductionist and so lacking in insight often, and patently wrong in some cases, that it leaves those who are, we're hoping to defer some of their thinking to some outside authority, feeling confused and perhaps angry. When dietary rules that are handed down are changing by the week because, frankly, much of what is passing for science now is data-driven rather than hypothesis-driven. And that's not what science is, right? Science is supposed to be driven by the questions, not by the conclusions. And so because of that, we have a lack of maturity in the would-be authority figures. When they're wrong, they tend to throw tantrums as well. And the rest of us, to the extent that all of us receive wisdom from some aspects of science, say, wait, if we can't trust them, where are the authorities whom we can have any trust in at all? And the answer increasingly is no one.
Is there a link to the shift, like the authority figures, there's a shift from the broadcast to the digital modality? I want to pick up on.
Sure. Yeah, it seems like maybe the best thing now is to put in more context. I think we've spoken a bit about the crisis in sense-making, and both at the level of epistemology and at the level of our capacity to communicate. I think there's at least two more distinct things to notice in the current environment that we've also brushed at by a little bit, but to maybe point out more clearly. The second is that the circumstances or the situation is novel. That the amount of complexity that is contained in the relationship between humanity, machine, and nature is vastly, vastly higher than our 20th century capacity for sense-making could ever have addressed. So, to the same thing that Bret just said. On the one hand, we're getting less and less capable. On the other hand, we are required to become more and more capable. But the third, I think, is something that's more challenging to grasp. And it's something along the lines of almost the way that we go about forming what I've called a collective intelligence. When I say what I've called, what I mean is that I've been using those words, even though I know that other people use those words differently. So, again, I'm gesturing at something. But there's the way that we think that we can go about improving the quality of our sense-making and our choice-making and our actuation as a group. And that itself is also problematic. And so what I find is quite often people who are perhaps appropriately sensing a certain problem, pick any problem you like, oftentimes then immediately follow up with prescriptions that are absolutely not going to work. In fact, oftentimes will be catastrophic. And so to be able to be mindful of the fact that all three of these things are simultaneously happening, I think allows us to at least be present to what's really going on.
Is there a left brain, right brain dynamic to what Jordan just described?
Yes, I think there is. I wouldn't want to sort of, as it were, take the conversation off too much in that direction.
Take
because,
any direction you want.
Well, yes, no, I mean, because I think that to do so properly would require context giving that I haven't the time and luxury now to do. But what I do think is, I resonate very much with what's been said. I think the comment that Heather made about science is a very interesting one, because in the book that I'm now writing, I ask the question, really it is about where do we get our ideas of what is true from? And I'm not going to give you the answer now.
You have to buy the book, everyone.
You have to buy the book. And I look at what I think most people would agree would be probably the four most important possible routes: science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And I look at the pros and cons of each of these, basically, with an eye to the hemispheres and what they contribute. And one of the things that's been very difficult for me to negotiate, it seems to me straightforward, but I can see how it will be misunderstood, is that I want to make the point that science has its strengths and it has its weaknesses. In some ways, the history of science is the history of mistakes, because that's how science improves. And so we need to be appropriately skeptical about everything, including what scientists tell us. But I am absolutely not wanting to encourage a sort of, so we can't believe science then. We ought to have the capacity, and it comes down to maturity again. And I think one of the signs of maturity is being able to harmonize opposites to be able to say, yes, science is very helpful, but it will be more helpful if we understand the ways in which it can mislead us. And the assumptions that it makes that are, I think, very restricting and vitiate the power of its message by restricting it to a certain kind of a worldview. And the same thing's true of reason. I mean, I couldn't write the book without relying enormously heavily on both science and reason. I believe in them profoundly, but I also believe that there are other things and that they can get us so far. And to use them responsibly, we need to know both what their strengths are and what their perfectly proper limits are.
Go ahead.
Just quickly, I'm reminded of a quote from Henri Poincaré, who I think I will butcher it, but let me see if I can do it, from 1904, great mathematician and philosopher of science, who said, "It is by logic that we prove, it is by intuition that we invent." And, of course, actual complete science requires both of those, right? The origin of hypothesis, you can't teach people how to have insight. You can expose them to enough experiences such that they are more likely to be open to insight and to recognize it when it happens. But all of the sort of quantifiable and regular parts of that process are not the most inspired parts, right? That first, the generation of hypothesis from observation, you have to have positioned yourself in some place and have been open enough to have had an idea.
And Poincaré, since you mentioned him, interviewed by letter over 100 mathematicians and scientists, and not one of them said that they came to their greatest conclusions by the route that is recommended by science. They saw them as insights and only later found out why they were right. It's almost invariable finding in great scientists and mathematicians. Obviously, not terribly great ones will have to just follow procedures and hope they get somewhere.
So actually, 2 points. One has to do with what I would say the right term for what you've just described is intuition, which has a kind of a bad rap because there is a wide range in the quality of intuition, right? So what I would argue is that somebody who has understood some area of phenomena or some discipline well is that they have a well-trained intuition. They know where to look, but they don't necessarily know why that's the place to look. They just know what sounds like the way nature works and what doesn't sound like the way nature works. So we need to resurrect the concept of intuition and legitimize it. It is a part of the scientific method, but not described in the list of things that you do because it happens largely unconsciously. The other thing is, in describing people's relationship to science, you correctly raise the question of, well, should we disbelieve science? That's very dangerous. Should we believe it? That's dangerous. But one of the things that's hidden there is that we don't have a good detector for when something actually is science. And if we did have a detector, this problem becomes much simpler. If you go to the journal Science, or Nature, but Science might be better for this example, and you say, well, how many of these papers that are in this week's volume are actually scientific? It's actually a small fraction, right? In order to be scientific, they have to have followed from an observation, there has to be a hypothesis, it makes predictions, and then there's a test. Now, you could write a paper that describes an observation from which those other things would follow, or maybe the paper is the result of a test that is in reference to some hypothesis. But if you go to the paper and you say, well, all right, this is obviously an experiment, what is it a test of? What's the hypothesis? It's frequently absent. What's more, sometimes you'll find that when it is present, it followed in the wrong order. Somebody collected data, saw a pattern, and then reported it as if it was the test of a hypothesis, which it isn't. So if you could just simply spot whether or not the scientific method had been followed in the case of each of these things, you would recognize it was a small fraction of the things in the journal, and those were the most reliable things there, because the philosophy of science is what actually gives us some reason to be confident in the conclusion of something that has followed this method well. So, in part, the distrust of science is a bum rap, because most of the things that cause us to recognize that it is false weren't science to begin with. They were just, they wore a lab coat, They report it in a journal that says it's scientific, but they weren't the scientific method.
So we've got just under 10 minutes left for this part. What I'd like to do is to invite each of you, and I'm going to time it for 2 minutes, because we went out for dinner last night, we talked through kind of the idea for the event, and I think all of us feel some sort of resonance with what we're trying to create here together. I'd just like to ask you each to talk for a couple of minutes about what you want to achieve. What speaks to you about this event, and why you think these kind of events are important, just to sort of set the frame. So I'm going to ask Bret to start, 2 minutes, and I'm going to time you on the kitchen timer.
Sure. It's a little hard to put my finger on, but I do think, based on what I've seen over the last 2 years, that there is some sort of a reorganization of alliances. There's an awakening happening and a change in allegiances, where people are realizing that those that have traditionally been their allies may not be natural allies, and that people that they have viewed with suspicion may be closer to them than they had expected. The problem is, in order for those alliances to function, you have to learn how people on the other side of them actually think. And this is very perilous when you encounter people who have developed their expertise somewhere else, even if it's an adjacent discipline, and you try to have a conversation. It very frequently ends badly because you've redefined terms and some nuance hasn't been picked up, and you think you know what the other person's saying, and then sooner or later they say something that's just beyond the pale to you. The remedy involves us talking to each other enough that we begin to understand what the other person's cognitive model is. And I see the hope for bootstrapping our way out of the predicament that we humans are in. That hope arises from our hearing each other enough to develop a shared model that will allow us to say provocative things that are true and then act on the basis of them.
Very good.
Good. Mostly that. Maybe just to add, we all could use more humanizing of each other. We're all someone's deplorables, probably, right? If you describe any brief ideology to which we appear to subscribe. And I think the greatest failures in communication happen when we have allowed those ideas about each other to get in the way of actually remembering that every single person that we interact with is just as human and sometimes brave and sometimes scared and sometimes certain and sometimes quite uncertain as the being that you are in your own head. Every single one of us. And what I have seen as the biggest failures of communication, of empathy, when mob rule came to our campus, it was clear that there was dehumanizing that happened first. So the more conversations we can have in which we look people in the eyes and learn the human on the other side, the more likely we are to be able to take that out into the world and not view anyone, no matter what their views may be, as a caricature.
Right. Jordan.
Sure. So I would say, very much along these lines, that first would be a hope that we can, each of us, be supported in discovering more deeply and be brought into more insight into that aspect of the larger story that is ours specifically to hold, and to be renewed in our hope in the context of that larger story. And then perhaps as the day evolves, perhaps feeling a sense of there being an insight that is larger than ourselves, that is also present.
You're very concise. I haven't needed the kitchen timer once yet. Iain, you've got 3 minutes if you want to.
I wouldn't want you not to be able to use your kitchen time. I agree with all of that. I would like to see people go away feeling a little more confident in being able to cause ripples a little. I think it's extraordinary that when I was growing up, and I'm much older than anybody else here, in the 50s and 60s, it seemed to me that we were entering an era in which there was enormous freedom, and indeed there was. And it's rather paradoxical that we now find ourselves in one of the more constrained intellectual environments. I never saw this coming. And I think that being able to take an unpopular position should be something we can all do without fear of being dehumanized. I think there's nothing that cannot be said. It's the way in which it's said. So I don't think we should censor content. I think we should censor manner. And I think that everything can be said as long as people say it in a respectful way. That would be a much better principle, and I'd like to see it happening. I'd like to see in schools and universities people practicing taking the opposite point of view from the one they've just argued for. I think that should be part of everyone's education, and being scored, as it were, on how well they do it. I think that in university circles where there are debates, I think it should start with somebody stating a position, and their opponent must respectfully repeat, actually, that they understand what is being said before they then go on to say what they want to say. And this would produce what civilization is about: conversation and exchange of ideas and harmony. I just want to gloss the very heavy evolutionary biology idea that we're all in for ourselves. One of my very strong beliefs is competition is certainly part of the history of all life. But equally important, or I would say more important, is collaboration. And that actually all life is a matter of collaboration. Your body is a lot of bacteria that decided altruistically to get together and serve a common purpose. Everything that is living does so because it collaborates. And I would like us to be able to collaborate on things that are true and beautiful. And if we do that, we actually might get ourselves out of the hole we've dug ourselves into. Less than 3 minutes.
Well done. So yeah, just to thank the panel for this, and we're going to introduce the facilitators and let you know what's going to happen after the quick break.
So in a moment, we are going to go into our small groups. I just want to talk about the logistics of that, because in a moment I'm going to introduce the facilitators of the small groups. Everybody has in the back of your name badge 2 things. You have the name of a room, and you have a color. So the color is your group, and the name of your room is the name of your room that you're going to be in. So it will be obvious for signage, and we'll have some people to help out as well. The hub and all the rooms are named after old communication devices. So the hub, except the hub, which just felt like a good name for this room. So this is the hub. There's going to be 4 groups in here. The quill is the room you got your coffee in, just next to us. And then all the other rooms are upstairs, except for one, the fax. The fax, if you have the fax, you come to this room, towards the back, and Rob Wilson, wave Rob, will take you to your room.
It's important to get people into smaller groups because we have 150 people here attending the summit, and in a group of that size it's really difficult to create that level of intimacy and connection and understanding that you get in a smaller group of, say, 10, where we can really get a sense of, even in a day, we can get a sense of the other people in the group, we can get a sense of what they're bringing, who they are, and we build a certain trust, and a word we use is coherence. We're in a little bit more of a coherence with one another. I understand what you're saying, you understand what I'm saying. You might not agree with me, but at least we're meeting each other as human beings. So on one level it's around intimacy, and the other level it's around, it's much easier to have a conversation the smaller the group gets.
As Ali said, we spent the morning building up to what we're going to do now. We sort of got to know each other a little bit in our small groups and made some connections, and that's to build up the safety and the connection to do what we're going to do now. And we talked about before about sort of feeling how feeling stifled around certain topics and certain things that we're allowed to express and we're not allowed to express, certainly kind of made much worse by the kind of low bandwidth of social media, is a real issue. Yeah, and also the idea of thinking in public, that thinking in public has become very dangerous because things can be taken out of context, and for that reason, we are going to turn the cameras off now.
We shut off the cameras in the main room because the invitation to the speakers and to everyone else was to have a conversation around things we don't feel comfortable talking about in public. And that felt much easier to do with the cameras off. So right now, that's exactly what everyone's doing here. The speakers modeled that up on stage, and they discussed a variety of topics that aren't really, we're not able to discuss easily in public, either through social pressure or because they're quite complex, but mainly because we're stifled in some sense by a mob mentality that we're afraid to activate, and afraid to, whether it means we might lose our jobs, whether it means we'll get kicked out of our social networks. So there's a lot of fear and a lot of feeling of being stifled. And that's kind of what what everyone's exploring right now behind me, is that sense of, we call it thinking in public. So this idea that in order to really kind of reach truth with one another, we have to kind of take that risk to not really have a fully formed idea, to not quite know have a sense of something but not quite there, and also to be able to keep a balance in ourselves of monitoring our own responses and reactions so that we can be calm, we can listen properly, even if we're talking about or listening to a really challenging idea that might be so different to what we think.
We think it's really important to create these spaces because there are certain topics that people feel very shut down and able to express themselves. And we believe that unless we're able to express ourselves, then it's really difficult to even learn what we think about certain things, and to maybe express ourselves clumsily at first, but then be challenged in that. And the sense is that a lot of topics, the conversation is actually being shut down before we can talk about it. And that can't be healthy.
So the final part of the day, which is going to happen after this, is going to be the speakers once again coming up as a panel, and they're going to take questions effectively from the audience, but we're doing it in a slightly different way, because what we're interested in exploring is what emerges between us when we have conversations in this new way. And so there's a chairperson in each group, and the chairperson is going to write down 3 or 4 thoughts or ideas that have come up through these discussions, and then those are going to be curated and fed back to the speaker panel, who are then going to discuss them.
I must say, I think we're in very serious trouble, but I'm not depressed by it. I'm determined, and that feels all right. And so I think there's a way in which people imagine that they're going to be obligated to be depressed if they fully confront the problem, and it's not even natural. The thing is, if you're good at dealing with dire circumstances, if you have that characteristic, then you don't become panic. You become clear-headed in the face of such things. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I would say is, philosophically speaking, you're very lucky. Even living at this moment when it does seem to all be in jeopardy, you're very lucky. You have presumably all of your, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is pretty much taken care of for you if you're sitting here. And that means that if you lost it all because we screwed this up and we didn't survive it, well, you still got a chance to live on this planet, to see remarkable things, to partner with people, to love, to do all of those amazing human things. And so therefore, what do you got to lose, right? I mean, you're going to lose it all in the end anyway, right? You're going to die. It's going to end. So you might as well, in some sense, face what's coming, recognize that it's dire, but that means it's also exciting, and it means that you live in a time of great meaning, potentially, and go for it.
Yeah.
Well, to some extent, Bret has just said what I was going to say, but I think somebody brought up in one of the discussion groups that one of the things we can't talk about is death. And I think that coming to terms with death is very, very important. The sooner one does it in life, the better. One accepts that nothing is here forever. Nothing at all will last forever. So it's only a matter of how long. And that doesn't mean it's worthless. That is one reason why it's valuable. And so encouraging a habit of being present for what there is, being grateful for the extraordinary richness that is open to us at every moment, and cultivating, as I think you were suggesting, Jordan, a kind of, yes, a virtuous personal life, is just now, as exactly it always was at any point in history, the reason that we're here and the best way to survive. So,
you
have something?
I think I was thrown by the question because panic is only one of many ways of avoiding action. And maybe you started here this morning in the first groups, right? What is it that happens when you lose your sovereignty, I think, is where you started. So some people panic, and some people retreat, and some people lash out, and some people retreat within themselves or sort of lose themselves into social scenes. And all of those are responses that aren't effective, although they can feel good in the moment or even for a lifetime. And I think there's actually universality in the value of, there ought to be urgency on many, many levels. For me, the one that I know best is also the one that I can advise, I think, action on best, which is environmental. I think almost everyone, no matter whether you are introverted or extroverted, deeply social, or have already found a way to be at peace in nature, can find a reminder of what is both true and beautiful in the world and worth preserving by spending time in nature. Making a regular practice, and I'm not talking about weekly if you don't live in a place where that's possible, although 3 of us up here live in places that are surrounded by fairly deep nature. A regular practice of actually going someplace where you can see things that are wild, that are not anthropogenic. And we've touched everything, even in the deepest, most remarkable field station in the Amazon where I've spent time, which is a plane ride over the Andes and a boat ride down a tributary of the Amazon and an open-air bus for several hours, and then another boat ride down another tributary of the Amazon, and you finally arrive at dusk, 14 hours after you embarked. No roads for hundreds of miles. There are still planes overhead twice a week. Jets flying way overhead, but there's still evidence, and that means that the Waorani, the people who still live there, also know that we're out there, right? That the rest of us are out there. So you can't ever escape, but go someplace where even though you know you can't see untouched nature, you can't see anything untrammeled, you can see something that is wild. You can see some animals and plants that are actually doing their thing, regardless of what we do. And for me, and I think for almost every human being, that will serve as the reminder of why the urgency is warranted and how you can remind yourself to be inspired to act.
Jordan? Yeah, you done? Okay, so I think that is to say thank you to the panel for an amazing day.
I also wanted to ask all the facilitators to stand up and make yourselves visible.
And a huge round of applause to say thank you. Woo! Woo! And thank you all for coming, really. This is, as I was saying at the beginning, this is really an experiment that as we started planning it, grew and grew and grew. And really feeling very grateful that you trusted us in that experiment and joined in with so much energy. Just walking around and listening to the small groups, I felt very actually jealous that I wasn't in one, to be honest. And we really see this as the beginning of something, the summit. We want to do more summits in the future. We want to develop it. So we really want to get your feedback as well. We're going to send something out to that effect, kind of just a kind of feedback form. And also, we want the conversation to continue. So everyone, in your bags, you have a little flyer, and there's information at the top. We have a forum set up specifically, a closed forum for just us, to talk through our website, to explore any ideas that have come up. We also run regular evening events. So we have 2 coming up. We have one with Jules Evans and one with Doshin Roshi, both of which are in your flyer as well. And we do this every time. So we want to keep building really a community. I feel right now this very strong sense of the importance of coming together right now. And yeah, we really want to do our best to create a space where that's possible.
Yeah, just to re-emphasize that, this is an experiment. It's an evolving conversation, and your input into that is really important. So please do feedback. We'll send out a feedback form in the next days. And any inspirations that you have about how we continue this conversation and widen it and deepen it, we can crowdsource all of that. And yeah, thank you so much for coming and diving into it and trusting us. And yeah, really touching. Thank you.
Round of applause for Iain. So, the bar is going to be open very soon. This bar right here. Yes, round of applause. Hey! So the bar is going to be open immediately. We have some chair scooting to do, so we just need everyone's help in just kind of making that area a little bit, if you disperse temporarily into the gallery bar, we'll clean the chairs, we can all come and have a drink in here. Then from 7:30, at any point after 7:30, we can start moving into 91 living room just across the road. It's in your map, in your bag, where our actual after party starts, and we have a nice little intimate space there and a DJ, and it's going to be lots of fun. So, yeah, look forward to having a drink all together. Thank you.
Thank you.
I thought we had a very good set of conversations, and certainly what I heard the smaller groups discussing sounded like they were energized by what they heard, and it provoked them to think in ways that they hadn't thought before, and certainly the questions that came back at the end suggested that there was a kind of, what would you say, there was an emergence to the conference that was palpable.
I think it worked out. I think that there was a very interesting question about what was going to happen. There was a continuous movement in a direction that felt very uncertain as it moved forward. And then, honestly, I had the very distinct sense of almost a pop or a push, where it felt like something actually shifted. And I hope, I've certainly felt in the conversations I've had afterwards, that many people felt like they had access to a deepening of their insight. And that's, I think, the best we could hope for.
It was good kind of networking and sense-making in the wild with a bunch of like minds, so I really appreciated that. The topics, the speakers were, they got into some heavy territory, which was great, and a lot to reflect on. And I'm motivated, without that sense of panic. So it's that healthy sense of urgency leaving this session today.
Activated some new ways of thinking. It's very attuned to my own values and what I do in the world. So it's a reinforcement and encouraging. I think it's been great for giving people a real sense of community and hope.
I thought it was an extraordinary day. It's really unusual to have the opportunity to see really high caliber speakers, an excellent facilitation on the stage, but then break out and take some of the themes that are being discussed down to the group level and have individual conversations. It's an experience as much as it is an event.
I've had a really amazing day because all of the people that I've been watching on the screen and like felt kind of separate from, like really excited by everything that they've been talking about and so passionate and so like I've really wanted to do something about it, but I felt like separate from it because I've just been looking at a screen by myself and being like, oh, I believe in this stuff so much. But yeah, just being in the same space as people has enabled me to kind of integrate all those ideas in like a more embodied way.
Figuring out how to talk to each other with generosity and enough precision to convey something important is one of the bigger questions of our age. We nominally share a language, but because of the way we live, that language is a blunt instrument. And so events like this that cause people to look at how they are communicating, what it is that they convey, and in what way they might reach across unbridgeable gaps more effectively, these are perhaps the key to us bootstrapping our way out of the rather serious situation we find ourselves in.
People who are conscious of the fact that the interior is as important as the exterior, in fact, more important right now, are, well, they're not entirely rare, but finding people who are conscious of that fact and are also competently and effectively putting it together with the exterior and the intellect is rare. And as far as I can tell, very important. There's no way that we're going to be able to do the things we need to do through using the forms of communication technique and the forms of mind that we currently have. And so we have to have some kind of shift. And so being able to be mindful of that work and have some skillfulness in that, and then experimentally trying to figure out how to actually deploy it in contexts that give rise to increasing levels of individual depth and insight is kind of a fundamentally new thing, and is vastly more helpful than all the various kinds of conversation that happen in just kind of the superficial intellectual layer.